couple of weeks ago. It is adapted from Meet It with Faith by Martha Smock. Martha Smock was the head of Silent Unity for 35 years, for a very, very long time, and is a very wise woman. It reminded me that every experience is our teacher. Sit with that. Every experience that we have had in the past 2, 4, 6 years is our teacher. We learn from persons, the events, the circumstances that surround us. Unfortunately, most of the time we are not aware that we're learning, because we are more aware of the struggle that we're dealing with. We're being molded and shaped not by the outer circumstances or by other persons, but from within, by our reactions to those people, situations, and circumstances, by our thoughts about those, our feelings, and our attitudes. Unless we have experiences to meet that allow us to seek deeper for understanding, reach higher for light, we do not develop along that spiritual path, in that our spiritual nature. This doesn't want to work for me, but that's okay. Revelations 4:1 says, "Come up here, and I will show you the things that must take place." And Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, said in Keep a True Lent, God is always calling us up higher, to a higher level of understanding, to a higher perspective, to a higher way of seeing things. To realize this truth is to give thanks for every person, even the hurtful ones. It is to give thanks for every experience, even the hurtful ones. It is to see everyone and everything as somehow a part of us. It is to be taught by all. In answering God's call to come up higher, to a higher level of understanding, a higher level of perspective, a higher level of seeing things. So if we are being taught by all things and all persons, why is it that we don't always learn that lesson that is there for us? Why is it that it seems as though the same problem comes back up for us to experience again and again? Until we meet a situation from within, learn from it, grow from it, grow through it, we will find it facing us again and again in a different way or form, but essentially the same problem. I don't know about you, but I don't want to face the myriad of difficulties that have invaded my life in the last 2 years. COVID has brought so many changes in our lives. Some of those I met with a knee-jerk reaction instead of just being with whatever I found annoying or just downright unacceptable to me at the time. Other times I was able to see it from a higher perspective, and rather than react, I responded more appropriately and was able to be grateful for the opportunity to learn, remembering that everyone and everything is a part of me. I've taken time to reflect on the many changes and losses, if you will, and it feels like that we have lost so much in such a short period of time. It's like this huge boulder named coronavirus was dropped into the lake of our lives. And we're still experiencing those ripples today that huge boulder created. Out of the necessity for my own well-being, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of grief work, which I've learned is necessary when we're experiencing any kind of loss. I've lost 2 sisters in the last 2 years. The coronavirus was not the cause of either of their deaths. But it did impact both their transitions. My older sister died of congestive heart failure in 2020 at the height of the outbreak in a community up in the Panhandle that was one of the hottest spots in the state of Texas. And none of her family, neither of her daughters could travel there. I could not travel there. My sister could not travel there. And in a conversation with the funeral director, I just simply suggested what we have learned to do in church work, and that's Zoom. I have become the queen of Zoom. I can Zoom. And I asked the funeral director if it would be possible for him to Zoom the graveside service, which was the only service that they were offering at the time, because of course it was outdoors. And he said, I've never done that, but I've got a niece who can. And that was his first experience with that. That was a teaching moment, not only for him, but for all of us. Because not everybody in the family was as comfortable with Zoom as I was. And yes, there was a lot of ritual in and around the loss of that particular loss that her daughters especially missed. Nobody was bringing food or flowers to the house. It just wasn't happening. It wasn't feasible. But I have to tell you that Reverend Sandra von Gillenband showed up at my house where my niece lives, my sister's daughter, and she had food and she had flowers because she knew that that was important for her. But it's all of these changes and how we choose to see them. And it's all a learning experience. And my younger sister struggled with cancer for over a year and passed away on the 21st of this year. I spent 2 months in Arizona with her last year and had planned to go back to be with her in June after the Unity Convention because her doctors had determined that there was nothing more they could do. The last day of the convention, like many, many other attendees, I tested positive for COVID. So my trip to Arizona was delayed by 3 weeks. And that was a loss in and of itself. And the last day of the convention, I was trucking it down the hall of the convention center to a diversity workshop that I had started the day before, and I wanted to get the second session. And I found myself in the ballroom with Reverend Richard Carnelli. He is a Unity minister, he's an RN, he's a hospice nurse. And he does beautiful workshops on grief and loss. And I had attended his workshop at the last convention and really, really, really wanted to get the last part of the diversity. And I can't tell you how glad I was I found myself in that room. He began with something that I had never heard of before. The term was anticipatory grief. And I was going, really? That's a thing?
Yeah.
And it is a thing. It is a thing because I was experiencing it. It's something that we experience when the inevitable is in sight. My younger sister's death was inevitable, and it was in sight, and I was dealing with a lot of grief at the time. And then, of course, when the inevitable happens, then there is another piece of grief that is to be addressed. It was all a profound teaching moment for me. And death, of course, is not the only loss that we need to grieve. It's like I said when I was talking about my sister Peggy, the older one, that passed away in 2020. Her girls had to grieve the loss of a ritual that they were familiar with, that they needed for comfort. A divorce is to be grieved because that's a huge loss. The loss of a dream, the loss of a pet, the loss of health, the loss of a home, loss of financial security, and the list goes on and on. Where do we begin with all of this? How do we do this? I've been a prayer chaplain for many, many years, and in prayer chaplain training, we're taught, of course, the 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross outlined in her book on death and dying in 1969. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And the one thing I want to impress upon you is that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. Nobody does it the same way. And chances are real good you don't do it the same way each time you approach it. It's always different. And of course, prayer is the first approach to any loss or change, as Jesus taught us. Prayer, in Matthew 6:6, Jesus tells us, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. And then your Father who sees what is in secret will reward you. Prayer is truly a teaching experience for me. That's where I have to start. Not just grief work, but everything. A dear friend gave me a book a few weeks ago. The title is The Grief Recovery Handbook, the action program from moving beyond death, divorce, and other losses, including health, career, and faith, written by John W. James and Russell Friedman. I want to read the first paragraph for you because it was very enlightening to me. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to any kind of loss. Therefore, the feelings you have are normal and natural for you. The problem is that we have been socialized to believe that these feelings are abnormal and unnatural. While grief is normal and natural, and clearly the most powerful of all emotions, it is also the most neglected, misunderstood experience, often by both the grievers and those around them. Grief is conflicting feelings. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or the change in a familiar pattern of behavior. Given the fact that this is a workbook, it's going to take me a while to do the work, to work my way through it. I have a lot to learn from these two men, and this is an experience that I will learn from and that I will grow from. For me, freedom is paramount. I want all the blocks that impede the flow of God moving in and through me, as me, removed. I want all those old, unsolved, ungrieved issues gone. I know that I will never not miss my sister's presence on this plane of existence, but I must do the grief work for those losses. It may take me a long time to finish this learning experience. Last week I was thinking that I was at the point of acceptance, the finish line, and thinking that I was done with all the other stages. Then a family member called, and as we talked, she reminded me how hard we had advocated for my younger sister, the one who had cancer, to go to Mayo's or MD Anderson for a second opinion. They're both right there in Phoenix. But in my sister's mind, it was too far to drive, and she refused. I can't tell you how many times I had that conversation with her. And yeah, it might have taken an hour, but in my mind, it would have been an hour well spent. But it was not my lesson to learn. And there I was in that conversation, back in the anger stage. Again, yet again. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Which is how I've learned that I grieve in the past. And all of this huge learning experience, I have learned that grace, God's grace, is the key. In the Revealing Word, Charles Fillmore defines grace as God's will, favor, disposition to show mercy, aid from God in the process of regeneration. By grace ye have been saved. Ephesians 2, 3. It is my belief that all of this turmoil that we have experienced and are continuing to experience is a part of the process. By grace, you are saved, rescued from the turmoil that COVID brought into our lives. Not being able to gather, which means the loss of connection. The necessity to wear masks everywhere for our own well-being. Not being able to see someone smile and learning how to smile with our eyes if we didn't already know how to do that. Shopping in a different way. I'm picky about my produce. And I don't want some 18-year-old picking my tomatoes, thank you very much. And yet, if I want tomatoes, the safest thing for me to do is to shop online. Same thing with clothing. Of course, I'm a very tactile person and I have to touch stuff. And if it doesn't have, as my mother would have referred to, if a piece of clothing doesn't have the right hand, I see heads nodding, some people know what I'm talking about, then I don't want it. Some of those things sound nitpicky, but how did you respond to those nitpicky things? I invite you to join me on the path of grace through the act of forgiveness. I can clearly see how vastly different the process of grief is once we're willing to forgive everything and everyone, including, hear me well, including ourselves. I'm not suggesting that forgiveness will replace the need to grieve our losses. I am suggesting that forgiveness will make the grieving work easier by removing all those people, situations, and things that we have not forgiven. Once we do that, we have a blank slate to use for our grief work. A blank slate to create our new normal. A new way of being in the world. A new perspective. A new understanding. A new way of seeing things as God is always calling us to do. So let's begin now. I would invite you to get yourself comfortable as we go into meditation.